All right, Emily, welcome to the second V-GTS. Thank you for coming to participate, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me here. Hang on a second while I get my settings right. Can you all see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, great.
So Emily, before you start and before we mute, we just wanted to talk about how we can change the view, how they can change the view so that they can just see you, because they don't need to see me. And they don't need to see anyone else really during this. So for you guys, you're probably seeing 4 screens. And at the top left of those screens, there should be 4 different options. There's like a little bar, a bigger bar, 2 bars, and then like a chunk of bars. And you really want to go to that second from the left, and that's going to be your speaker view, so that once everyone's muted, including myself, the person that will appear here is going to be Emily, and then you'll see her and be able to hear her rather than see all the rest of us. That makes sense. If you want to see a bunch of other people, you're welcome to keep it at any other view. But I am going to go ahead and mute you all except for Emily for the next little bit.
Thanks very much for inviting me to be here today. I think that probably a lot of what I'm talking about will be review for many of you, but I kind of wanted to, well, I'll start off by talking about the native fish ecology and conservation program at Grand Canyon. But I'm going to start with just some background on the native fishes in Grand Canyon and some of the challenges and some of the conservation work that we're doing. Lots of folks that you all know have been a part of this program and been contributors to it. Oh, hang on. I'm timing myself so that I don't go way too long. Lots of folks have also worked with us and volunteered with us, and we're really grateful for that. And also lots of various funders to acknowledge. But again, today I'm just going to review the native fishes of Grand Canyon. There's a couple of new pieces of information that might be interesting to you in that portion. Briefly touch on the threats that the native fishes face, and then talk about what we're doing to help conserve them. Oops. And there. So to start off, there were 8 fish species that were native to Grand Canyon. The humpback chub, the bony tail, flannelmouth sucker, Colorado pike minnow, bluehead sucker, round tail, razorback sucker, and speckled dace. Of those 8 fishes, 75% of them are endemic to the region. So the humpback chub, the bony tail, the round tail, flannelmouth sucker, Colorado pike minnow, and razorback sucker are all found only in the Colorado River Basin and its tributaries, and not in other places in the world. There's a little star here on the bluehead sucker because there were some morphological and genetic studies done kind of recently, but not terribly, that really separated our blueheads out from some of the others. So now they are thought to be endemic also to the Grand Canyon, Colorado River Basin anyway. So now we can say we have 88% of the native fishes here are endemic only to this region. Why is that? Most of these fishes have adaptations to a big, fast-moving and muddy river. Things like small eyes, few scales, and thick leathery skin. Many of them are large in size, and several have a hump or a keel behind their head also. 50% of those fish are also endangered. So the humpback chub, bony tail, razorback sucker, and the Colorado pike minnow. Again, you're going to see some stars here because recently the humpback chub and the razorback sucker have been proposed by the Fish and Wildlife Service to be downlisted from endangered to threatened. I've put some definitions here. So Fish and Wildlife said that conditions have improved for the humpback chub so that the 3 R's that they use to determine status have now been met. So there's sufficient resiliency, redundancy, and representation so that the humpback chub is not currently at risk for extinction in its range. And the difference there is that a threatened species is actually likely to be endangered in the foreseeable future, but not currently at risk of extinction. And so that's the thought process behind the Fish and Wildlife Service proposal to downlist. Sorry, I have some dogs here helping out. You guys can be quiet. Anyway, so the other species, the razorback sucker, has also been proposed for downlisting to threatened. And this one has a little bit of a different situation. So the Lake Mead population of razorback sucker is the only population that reproduces and recruits to adulthood on its own. Every other group of razorback sucker in the world has to be stocked and managed for them to complete their entire life cycle. And so this is kind of an interesting one because in the Fish and Wildlife Service's own writings, they say that scientists are hard at work to determine the best way to encourage survival of juveniles to naturally sustain the population. So this is more of an interesting proposal, I think. And just so that you know kind of a sketch of the proposal process, it begins over here with a species status assessment. That moves into a 5-year review and recommendation. And then the Fish and Wildlife Service proposes a 4D rule, makes a proposal and proposes a 4D rule that, that dictates the levels of protections that the species will have if it is downlisted to threatened. The next stage is that there's a publication of the rule and a public review. So this is an opportunity for everybody to get involved and provide input on the proposals. And then lastly, a final rule is published and the status change becomes official. So the razorback sucker at this point are in this internal 4D rule making within the Fish and Wildlife Service. So the next stage would be a federal rule publication and an opportunity for folks to provide input into that proposal. Humpback chub here have just completed their public review period, which ended in March. And they're in the process of looking through the comments and will eventually publish a final rule. So back to our 8 native fishes. 3 of those 8 are currently extirpated from Grand Canyon, meaning they no longer exist in Grand Canyon. And that's the bony tail, the Colorado pike minnow, and the round-tailed chub. And I will say that in 2019, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service launched a Colorado pike minnow reintroduction feasibility study. And so they designed this as a phased approach to just investigating the possibility for Colorado pike minnow in Grand Canyon. Phase 1 was the implementation of a steering committee and an expert panel who actually went down on a dive and down trip in September to look at the habitat and come up with some recommendations. And that is all going to be put together into a summary report that will then determine if next phases are taken. So that's an interesting piece of information out of Fish and Wildlife Service. And the report is being put together by GCMRC also. So why have we seen this decline in native fishes? We've got habitat modification taking place and introduced non-native fishes, including rainbow trout, brown trout, and channel catfish. In terms of the habitat modification, I think we're all familiar with the fact that dams alter the hydrology, thermal regime, and sediment conditions in a system. Here you're looking at discharge before dam closure. This red line indicates dam closure, and then after. And here we're looking at water temperature with the same red arrow at dam closure. We've also got on here a line, the temperature required for humpback chub reproduction, and the red line down here is humpback chub growth requirements. And so luckily for us in Grand Canyon, we have a lot of tributaries that put in warmer water and provide good habitat for growth and reproduction of those humpback chub. Also, non-native fishes eat natives and compete for resources with them. I think we're all pretty aware of that. So how did we get the non-natives? In the early 1900s, catfish and carp were introduced into the system. Hey, no. And then trout were introduced by the agencies, including the Park Service. Sorry, guys. Trout were introduced in the 20s into the tributaries of Grand Canyon by the Park Service and other folks. The Park Service continued to stock until 1964. Arizona Game and Fish Department continued to stock in the Lee's Ferry area until the 90s. And then they actually began to stock again in the 2018 and 19 periods. They stocked some sterile rainbow trout into the Lee's Ferry area. Maybe if I shut the window, the dogs will be quiet. Okay. And I think this is a good place to remind ourselves of the Park Service mission, which is to preserve unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and values of the park system for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. And so this stocking is contrary to the MPS mission, and they acknowledged that it was, but felt that recreational benefits overruled biological disadvantages that incidentally incurred. And it's only in the latter half of the 20th century that we actually began to understand how ecology works and how species impact ecosystems and the importance of all of those interactions. And I guess I'll just also add that despite all of these challenges, that Grand Canyon is a stronghold for native fishes. So we have the largest and most stable remaining humpback chub population in the world. We have natural reproduction of humpback chub. We have spawning razorback sucker in Grand Canyon, and our imperiled native suckers are really abundant in the canyon also, to the extent that below Marble Canyon, we have 95% native fish in the system. So that's against all odds. The natives are doing really well. So now I'll move on to what we are doing at Grand Canyon to help conserve some of the native fishes. And the two main things are tributary translocation of humpback chub, non-native fish removal in Bright Angel Creek, and then I'll get a little bit into razorback suckers that we're working with some other cooperators on in Lower Grand Canyon. So humpback chub, here's a picture of a beautifully colored up spawning condition humpback chub here. And then in the corner is a juvenile humpback chub before the characteristic hump has developed. There are 6 core populations of humpback chub in the world. 5 of them are in the upper Colorado River Basin above Glen Canyon Dam. And those include Dinosaur National Monument, Deso and Gray Canyons, Black Rocks, Westwater Canyon, and Cataract Canyon. And then the 6th one is in Grand Canyon, and that consists of primarily the Little Colorado region and the river right outside of that. And then also some aggregations that are kind of spread throughout the rest of the river. And this map shows you in red the critical habitat designated when the fish were listed. Also, the present distribution is in green, and the historical distribution is there in red. One more thing on that. The Grand Canyon, like I said, is the biggest and most stable and most geographically spread out population of humpback chub that's left. So all of the others in the upper basin are generally in decline. Some of them have gone to salvage. So this Grand Canyon population is really a stronghold here. And that is part of why we started with this translocation process, because Little Colorado River is basically the center of the humpback chub universe. Almost all of the reproduction, and all of it really until recently, takes place around the Little Colorado River, which kind of makes it precarious. So if there was any disease that kind of swept through that particular area, any sort of spill that happened, as you all know, there's highways that cross over the Little Colorado upstream. So this is a really valuable population. And so the idea with translocations was to move fish from the Little Colorado River and to put them into some other areas so that we can develop some redundancy in Grand Canyon in case something catastrophic happened. And so in 2000, some researchers did some research into the tributaries of Grand Canyon and determined that Havasu Creek, Shinumo Creek, and Bright Angel Creek were the most likely to support populations or groups of humpback chub if they were translocated. So we've got, here's the Little Colorado River. As you know, we've got Bright Angel Creek, Shinumo Creek, and then Havasu Creek further downstream. So before we started translocating, we conducted baseline surveys in each of the creeks that we were focusing on. All of these fish were collected from the Little Colorado River. In the beginning, we collected young of year humpback chub, and then there was some concern that we shared that we didn't want to, in the process of doing these, impact negatively the chub that were at the Little Colorado River. And so we did some modeling and got a group of folks together and determined that if we took larval humpback chub from the Little Colorado region, we would not impact the population at all. And so we switched to collecting just larval fish after the first couple of years to kind of protect that population. Shush. Those fish are generally helicoptered or hiked out, driven to a hatchery where they spend the winter being treated for parasites and any bacterial diseases. Then they are they get a pit tag in each of them so that we can track them over their lifespan once they've been released into Grand Canyon. They are then driven from New Mexico back to the helipad at Grand Canyon and helicoptered into Grand Canyon into the creek. And so I don't know if you can see here, we've got a helicopter with a 100 or 200 foot long line, and there's a cooler at the end of there somewhere. And then they're released into their new creek. After the release, we monitor both the chub that were translocated and the other fish in the creeks and the nearby main stem outside of there. And we do some of that main stem work with Fish and Wildlife Service and GCMRC collaborators. So when we started this, there was a couple things that we thought could happen and that we hoped would happen. First, we hoped to get a second spawning and recruiting population in a tributary outside of the Little Colorado. Second good thing that we thought could happen is that we could kind of make a grow out area. So we could take these fish from the Little Colorado River, put them into a creek where there's a lot of food and there's warm water, let them grow up. And then if they went out into the main stem, they'd be kind of more able to deal with the challenges there. And they would augment those aggregations that are throughout the river. And then lastly, we didn't hope this would happen, but we acknowledged that there was potential for failure. So either the chub don't stay, we never see them again, they die, something like that. Once they were in the creeks, we were interested in whether they would remain and live, whether they would move out and move into the aggregations, and whether we would see any reproduction in there. And this is a lot of words, you don't have to read it. Basically, how we would decide if this was successful or not, in most cases, was comparing it to the Little Colorado population and the Colorado River ones that are right around there. So first, whether the chub were going to stay over the first year, whether they would grow and survive as well as they would have if we'd left them in place in the Little Colorado, whether they would actually help with the numbers and the other main stem aggregations, and whether we would see reproduction and recruitment. So those are basically our metrics that we were looking to measure. Again, all the fish came from the Little Colorado River. We started with Shinumo Creek in 2009, and between then and 2013, we translocated just over 1,100 fish there. We started working in Havasu Creek in 2011, and between then and 2016, we translocated just shy of 2,000 fish into there. And then in 2018, we began work in Bright Angel Creek with the first translocation of 116, roughly, chub. One note, the chub that we translocated into each creek were of pretty different sizes. So this pink grouping here were the fish that went into Shinumo Creek. As I said before, in the beginning, we were pulling larger fish out of the Little Colorado River, and then we started to go with some larval collections. So they kind of represent a larger range of sizes, and also, the Havasu Creek is this gray bar here, and those ones were more around the 100 to 120 millimeter size range. And then these dark red bars are the Bright Angel Creek fish. So they had initially been collected to be translocated elsewhere, and we weren't able to do that. And so by the time they were released into Bright Angel, they were actually adult fish. And so there might be some interesting things that we can learn about the life stage that the fish are at when they were translocated. In Shinumo, basically from 2019 to 2014, we found that we were meeting our objectives in terms of growth and augmentation. And so they were growing really well compared to the Little Colorado River. Some were definitely leaving, but sticking around in the river outside of the Shinumo Creek. So that really looked like a successful sort of grow out creek. In 2014, the Galahad fire started on the North Rim and eventually ended up burning down into the canyon a little bit. This map at the top shows the headwaters of Shinumo Creek. which consist of Merlin abyss here and Modred abyss on the other side. And you can see this red is the fire, is the Galahad fire boundaries. So the fire burns down into the Modred abyss canyon. After that fire, there was a couple of monsoon caused giant floods that came through. And so everything that came from the Merlin side over here just was a big flood, which our native fishes are well adapted to. But everything that came from the Modred side was full of ash. Randy Van Hatterbeek with Fish and Wildlife Service was downstream 20 miles when one of the floods came through and said the whole river looked like a campfire. The whole river turned black when this first flood came down. And so everything, unfortunately, below Merlin, below Modred, all the fish were killed. So basically, we lost all humpback chub and all bluehead suckers from the creek. We'd still had speckled ace and rainbow trout, non-native rainbow trout, up in the Merlin side. And so over time, since then, the speckled ace and native came back really quickly in colonies to the whole creek. And then unfortunately, more recently, the rainbow trout have also come back in colonies to the whole creek. So that's one of the things that we're watching. We're watching the creek recover, we're monitoring the insects, temperature, geomorphology, and also looking at those fish come back as well. This is a look at movement of translocated fish. And so here at 0, fish that left Shinumo Creek and were picked up in the main stem, most of them stayed really close to that area, right around Shinumo Creek. Some of them went, 20 miles or so downstream, but the majority of ones that moved that we saw actually went back up to the Little Colorado River. And so this is a frequency. This isn't the number of fish. I think it's more like 15 or so fish moved up to the Little Colorado River, and we picked them up fairly frequently. Okay, moving on to Havasu Creek. We saw growth that was similar to the Little Colorado River. We saw survival that was similar to the Little Colorado River. We have been able to handle 51% of the fish that were translocated into there. So we're seeing pretty good retention in that creek. And then the most exciting piece of information is that we have found a second reproducing population of chub in that Havasu Creek. So right around 2015 or so, we started to see a really strong group of young non-translocated fish showing up in Havasu. And we can follow that trajectory through and see larger and larger groups of young fish that are produced in Havasu Creek and recruiting into adulthood. And so that was a really exciting find and continues to be. This is a look at, again, movement, like the one I showed from Shinumo. So here at 0 is the area right around Havasu Creek. Some fish moved as far as 50 plus miles downstream. Looks like probably one in each case. And then a few have actually moved all the way up into the Little Colorado River again. So there's a lot more data out there. I know that Fish and Wildlife Service has a lot of these data, and Pilar is working on working some of that up. So we're really excited to see some of those results. And then in Bright Angel, we just translocated the first round in 2018. We plan in June to translocate another about 300 or so fish into Bright Angel Creek. And so we only have really preliminary information out of there. We had some trouble with flooding during monitoring trips in 2019. We do have a pit tag antenna installed in Bright Angel Creek, so we can get some good data out of that. But our preliminary apparent survival, which takes into account fish that have either, survived and stayed. So this doesn't count any fish that left the creek, but we're seeing about 80% apparent survival of the translocated fish into Bright Angel. We also have seen 4 chub that were initially tagged in the Colorado River and have come up into Bright Angel Creek. And 1 that was translocated into Shinumo Creek has come up into Bright Angel Creek as well. So we're excited to continue to watch those interactions. Next, in translocations, we are going to continue to monitor the recovery in Shinumo Creek. and the trout expansion, and decide if it is a good candidate for further translocations, or if that's not necessarily the direction that the community wants to go. Oh, we have redundancy in Havasu Creek in that we have a second reproducing population in Grand Canyon, which was the main goal of the project. And then in Bright Angel Creek, we're going to continue translocating, as I said, next month, and continue trout removal, which I will get into now. So this is sort of the second phase of things that we are doing in Grand Canyon to help the native fishes, and that's the Bright Angel Creek Trout Reduction Project. The purposes are to benefit the chub in the Colorado River and benefit the chub and other native fishes that once were in the Bright Angel Creek. And so we do that by running a fish trap or weir in the wintertime when the trout are spawning, and also by backpack electrofishing in the creek. Brown trout, the reason that we targeted Bright Angel Creek is because here is x-axis is river mile along the Colorado River, y-axis is the catch per unit effort. And basically you can see that most of the brown trout in the whole Colorado River system are centered around Bright Angel Creek. There's residents that live up in Bright Angel Creek year round, and then there's a bunch of them that come up only to spawn and then go back into the Colorado River afterwards. So we targeted that area for that reason. Also, we know that brown trout are a greater threat to native fish than our rainbow trout. Felt like it was an important thing to minimize. So we hoped to reduce trout abundance by 80%. We hoped to improve the populations of native fishes in Bright Angel Creek, and to eventually translocate humpback chub into there if we could meet that trout reduction target. And spoiler alert, you already knew what happened. We already did that. But another thing that is a really important part of all of the work that we do is this idea of beneficial use. And so as you all know, there's a lot of the tribes that are associated with Grand Canyon find it to be very sacred, and also generally share concerns about the taking of life in that sacred area. And so we have agreed, to the extent feasible, to use all trout that we remove and provide them for human consumption. Or in the case of the really small ones, we provide them to the Zuni and the Navajo for feeding their ceremonial eagles. We used to do some smoking of all the fish. We would smoke them and then give them to folks, and now we mostly clean them out and then freeze them and distribute them that way. Another thing that we've agreed to do, the Zuni in particular find Bright Angel Creek to be particularly sacred, and so in consultation with those folks, we avoid Ribbon Falls Creek entirely, and we avoid confluences because those are important areas for them. So a quick overview of Bright Angel Creek electrofishing results. These over here show our brown and rainbow trout removals. And basically from 2012, when we started electrofishing the entire creek, we have affected a 97% reduction in the brown trout in the creek, and a greater than 80% reduction in the rainbow trout. And moving to the other side with the natives, both native flannelmouth, blueheads, and speckled ace, we have seen an over 480,000% increase in the native fishes in the creek. So as the trout populations have gone down, we're seeing increases in the native fishes. We're also seeing those natives move farther upstream. So every year they move a little bit farther upstream as those trout continue to decline. So we met the targets in Bright Angel, and we move forward with translocation, as you know. And then, like many things in Grand Canyon and elsewhere, there's good news and bad news. And so I will start with the good news because I'm an optimist. Here we have Arizona Game and Fish data, electrofishing data from Grand Canyon. And over the last 20 years, oh, let me point out, these purple bars are times when the weir was installed. And in this later case, when we were electrofishing the whole creek. And so over the last 20 years, Arizona Game and Fish has noted a decline in brown trout in the system, with the 2018 numbers the lowest that they have seen in 20 years. The bad news is, this is also Arizona Game and Fish electrofishing data from the Lee's Ferry area, beginning in about 2014, we've started to see a dramatic and significant increase in brown trout in the Lee's Ferry region. So here's our whack-a-mole. Let's see, 2017 or 18, a group of scientists got together for a workshop to try to look into some hypotheses about what happened. Why did we see this increase in brown trout? They were adult brown trout that started showing up at Lee's Ferry and are reproducing. So there's several ideas about why this could be happening. This group evaluated those ideas and talked about some potential interventions and what the success would be in trying those. The publication, it's a USGS open file report that came out from that, doesn't answer anything. We don't know which hypothesis is correct at this point, and we don't know what the right intervention is for many reasons. And so that's something that's still being worked on. The Park Service has agreed to put together an incentivized harvest program as a first step before any sort of mechanical removal or anything would be taken at Lee's Ferry. So this incentivized harvest is a program where anglers would actually be paid to target and catch brown trout in Lee's Ferry. So they would bring back a head of a brown trout and they would get some sort of payment for that. There's also a component of this incentivized harvest project that would take tribal elders and tribal youth out into that area as well. And so we're hoping to start that. That's a Glen Canyon National Park project, not a Grand Canyon. But I'm thinking that they're starting that hopefully in the fall, although that might be a little bit delayed. And so the last thing that I'm going to talk about quickly is are these Razorback sucker surveys that we're doing in the lower Grand Canyon with BioWest and ASIR and the Nevada Game and Fish. So until 2012 and 2013, we thought that Razorback sucker were extirpated from Grand Canyon. This is a map of the more recent sightings and collections of Razorback sucker throughout the river. And you'll notice that the latest one was in 2000. And then we hadn't seen them for 20 years. And we thought that, well, not 20 years, for a while. And we thought that they were gone. And then in October 2012 and October 2013, there were Razorback sucker that were tracked moving up from Lake Mead. And also Game and Fish captured a couple of them, including this beautiful, wild, untagged subadult, actually. That's not even an adult fish there in the Spencer Canyon area. And so first big news, Razorback sucker are no longer extirpated from Grand Canyon. So in 2014, we started a project looking at seining at various locations below Phantom Ranch and also putting some sonic tags into some larger fish and releasing them and tracking them with these submersible ultrasonic receivers that we can either pull along in a boat or we have some installed in the river that can kind of listen for these sonic tagged fish to pass by. And so the first big news was that larval Razorback sucker were found throughout that area in lower Grand Canyon, meaning that we had Razorback sucker spawning in Grand Canyon. We have not seen any of the small-bodied fish, which you heard earlier. The only place that fish are actually moving from into adults are in the Lake Mead area. And so we don't see that in Grand Canyon still. But we did see a lot of other native fishes, including Humpback chub, throughout the lower Grand Canyon. And that sort of spurred a lot more study in that area. And at the same time, there was this dramatic increase in Humpback chub in that area too. So that now we've sort of added this Western Grand Canyon population to our discussions about Humpback chub, and GCMRC and Fish and Wildlife Service and Game and Fish are all doing a lot of work down in there to try to understand more about that population. This is a penny here, and that's a larval Razorback sucker for size. Here are some of the trends that we've seen in this study from 2014. Here we have year along the x-axis, and we have a catch per unit effort along the y. The blue bars are bluehead suckers in that area. greenish is flannelmouth, and these red down here are the razorback suckers. And so what you'll notice is we've seen a significant decrease in the larval razorback suckers throughout the study time from 2014 to 2019. And at the same time, we have not seen a decrease in the bluehead suckers and the flannelmouth sucker. And so there's a lot of discussion now about what's going on here. And so over here, we have a plot, again, of year on the x-axis. We have water temperature along the top. We have discharge in cubic feet per second in the yellow, and then hydropeaking, which is a measure of how much the flow release changes in a day. And so what it looks like from this sort of red barred section here is that perhaps temperature has been important in this decline in the razorback sucker. Perhaps flow is important. We don't know. We're still looking at all of these things. And so one of the steps we're going to take is to convene an expert panel of razorback sucker. Hopefully, it was planned for July or for the summer of 2020 to try to dig into what we are seeing here. Another one of the ideas is that we all know that Pierce Ferry has changed over time and seems to be getting worse and worse. And so in the beginning of this study in 2014, we saw a lot of movement of tagged fish between Lake Mead and the Grand Canyon. And we're starting to think that those played important roles in the life cycle, that there was some sort of movement back and forth, and that both of those pieces were important to the razorback sucker story. And it seems like that movement has stopped. And so perhaps it's a barrier to movement, which is impacting spawning in Grand Canyon. Another thing I'll just throw at you is again, Lake Mead population is the only place that we have razorback sucker completing their whole life cycle. And this is a look at the abundance of adults in Lake Mead beginning in 2008 until 2019. And we've seen a decline there also. So that's another reason that we're anxious to get together a group of folks and talk about what's going on and try to see if there's something that we can do or should do to address this decline. And I'm going to end with, we love working with volunteers. And if you are interested ever in joining us, please do send me an email and we will hopefully get to work with you. And I'm going to stop sharing and take questions.
Thank you so much, Emily. I'm going to stop recording right now and then re-record again the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Emily.